Hello, Stingrays and Kippers. Ranger Bill, Mr. Dias here again. As promised, it's spring break and time for me to read The Witch of Pungo. A little bit about this book. I grew up with this. My mother gave me a copy of it when I was a child, and most of it takes place in settings that were very close to the neighborhood I grew up in here at Cape Henry. So the places in the story were very familiar to me growing up, and I made it a habit of getting to those places and living out a pretty fun, adventurous life as a child at Cape Henry. I wanted to share that with you by reading each of the chapters of the book in the setting in which it was written, or at least in the setting in which it was the story was written. The first part of the book begins at Cape Henry, which is where we are right now. I'm at the Joint Expeditionary Base, Little Creek, Fort Story. It's always just going to be Fort Story to me. But it's also Cape Henry, and it's the location of the first landing of the British, the Virginia Company, that went on to form Jamestown and the first permanent English settlement in North America, or in the U.S., what is now the U.S. The huge cross, which you can't hardly miss behind me, signifies that first landing of those British ships. And when they did land, among other things, they planted a cross here at Cape Henry before proceeding up through the bay into the James River and up to what would become Jamestown. So the first story starts there. A couple things real quick to open up the book itself and try to give you an understanding of the book itself. Again, it's The Witch of Pungo. It's written by a woman named Louisa Venable who lived not far from where I grew up. The collection of stories was written at the request of the late Miss Louise Luxford of the Virginia Beach school system. The stories were read aloud by me and taped to help teach children something about the history of the area in which they lived. As often as possible, the actual family names are used. There's a historical background for every story. However, the stories themselves are fiction. Louise Venable Kyle. So, in that, I started this life of history and culture adventures. When I made it to high school, I was doing a paper on the history of Princess Anne County, which Virginia Beach was once called. And that's when I first came across Miss Louise Luxford, for which Luxford Elementary School is named after. She wrote a paper, I believe it was in her doctoral, or at least one of her graduate papers, called The History of Princess Anne County. Very good stories, good read, and that's what got me interested in her. Also contained herein is a foreword, which I do wish to read. Louisa Venable Kyle has been writing Tidewater, Virginia history, lore, and biography for close to a quarter of a century, and collecting it all of her life. Her column, A Countrywoman's Scrapbook, was a popular Sunday feature in the Virginia Pilot in the 1950s. Her advice on gardening, cooking, homemaking, and pleasant living has been published nationally. The stories include The Witch of Pungo. Both the factual data and the fiction built upon it are representatives of Miss Kyle's great ability to make this region's heritage meaningful and entertaining. Her love of home and homeworks, her joy in the travel, her lively spirit especially equip her for recording and interpreting the past of the generations of far horizons. These are stories of people, the Adam Thurgood family, Grace Sherwood, Blackbeard. There are stories of place, Princess Anne County, the Cape Henry Lighthouse, Dam Neck, and there are stories of time, of yesterdays, of ease, of stress. They indeed are stories for children of all ages. Robert Mason, former editor of Virginia Pilot. So, let's get started with the first chapter. Swiftfoot, a brave Indian boy at the cross of Cape Henry. Swiftfoot sat in the bow of the long canoe. Around his shoulders was his cape made of squirrel skins that his mother had put together for him. On his feet were soft moccasins. In his black hair were eagle feathers, dyed red, and near his feet he had placed his bow and arrows. His father, the chief of the Chesapeake Indians, named Machipungo, had given him the bow. He had made his own arrows by breaking oyster shells with a small tomahawk until they were the right size and pointed. He had a few stone arrowheads, too, which his father had brought him from a long journey. Swiftfoot was 12 years old. He was a strong Indian boy, and he lived in a village called Apasas. The place that he lived was at the mouth of the river that spread south from the great bay just inside the capes from the ocean. This was an exciting day for Swiftfoot, for he was going on a hunting trip. As he waited for his father and the other Indians, he could see in the distance the squaws and the children from the village planting corn in the great cleared fields. He also had fun watching the crabs as they moved about the canoe. It was a warm day in late April, 1607, but the Indians did not divide the year into months as we do. They would have called it the Katapeak, or budding time. The sun shone upon the water, and the waves splashed against the great canoe, which was large enough for 20 men to ride in. Years before, a storm had blown down a large tree. It had taken a long time and many men working to carefully burn out the center of the tree and scrape it with oyster shells until the trunk was carved into a canoe. At last, Swiftfoot saw the party of Indians, braves, led by his father, come out of the woods. With strong arms, they pushed the canoe off the sandy beach and climbed into it. With carved paddles, they pulled against the tide and headed east along the shore of the bay. Machipungo, the chief, did not work. He sat in the bow near Swiftfoot. The waves rocked the canoe, but it moved fast. Gulls screamed overhead, and now and then a fish jumped out of the water. The cool salt felt good on his bare shoulders as he removed his cape. Now and then Swiftfoot could dip his toes into the cold water. After several miles, the canoe rounded the cape, and the boy could hear the surf pounding. Soon the canoe turned toward the shore. It was exciting to ride in a big wave and have it break as the canoe scraped the sandy beach. The Indians lifted the canoe on their shoulders and carried it into the edge of the woods as they set up camp. Machipungo and Swiftfoot explored the beach, finding shells and other interesting things. Some of the Indians surf fished, and others went hunting in the great forest. Swiftfoot carried his bow and arrows as he climbed the great white dune. He then slid down the hill into the forest where there were pools of brown water with trees growing out of them. He saw a snake crawl down a bank and splash into the water. It was all new and different from the forest near the Indian village. The seasonal natural area still looks today as if it did more than, or the seashore natural area still looks today as if it did more than 350 years ago when Swiftfoot went hunting there. The sun was setting when the hunters got back to the camp near the ocean. They had a deer and rabbits, and Swiftfoot had killed a redbird with his arrow. The small oysters roasting and fish cooking made him feel very hungry. After he had eaten, he spread his cape in the canoe and curled up and went to sleep, listening to the whippoorwills call and pounding of the surf. The sun was coming out in the ocean like a big red ball when Machipungo awakened him for another day of hunting. It was beautiful in the forest, with yellow, flowering vines growing over the ground and up the tree trunks. There were purple blossoms on some trees and white on others, and lilies and ferns on the ground. And pollen in the air, I would suspect. The second day, Machipungo shot a turkey, and Swiftfoot almost killed a squirrel. As they crossed the great dunes above their camp, the boy found a tall tree. He climbed to the top to look around and saw a strange sight far up the beach. He climbed down and told his father to come see. Just offshore, in an inlet, were three huge ships. On the beach, smoke came from a fire, and there were people milling about. The Indians crept along, just behind the crest of the sand dunes, until they came nearer to the ships. These people, they saw, were not Indians, but men who wore strange clothes and spoke a different language, a different tongue. Their faces had as much hair as their heads. The Indians crawled over the dunes on their hands and their knees, holding bows in their mouths. Silently, they moved closer. Machipungo had heard of men different from the Indians who had come long ago and tried to make a settlement, but had sailed away. Swiftfoot forgot he was tired, for he was too excited. He did just what the other Indians did. When they were close enough to use their bows, the Indians shot arrows at the strangers. Several arrows hit their mark. Then the strangers rushed to pick up what Swiftfoot thought were sticks, about 3 feet long. Suddenly, there were loud noises and flashes of fire. The Indians turned and rushed to the woods. When safely out of the sight, the Indians gave a loud war whoop. Swiftfoot had practiced his strange yell at play, but now he knew, as he joined in the whooping, that he was growing up. Suddenly, he felt like a warrior. When the Indians reached camp, they treated their wounded and held a long powwow around the fire. Swiftfoot fell asleep, but his father decided to send home the wounded by canoe. Half the party went with the wounded to warn the villagers, telling them to keep watch and hide if the strangers came. At first, Matchpungo wanted to send Swiftfoot home, but he decided to let him stay and learn to spy on the enemy. To see what? To see, but not be seen. Swiftfoot saw many strange sights during the next few days. He did not realize he was watching what was to become an important historical event that would change his whole life. This was the landing of the English settlers at Cape Henry. These men would move up the river to Jamestown and establish a settlement that was the birthplace of our country, these United States. On the third day of his hunting trip, the Indian boy and his father silently watched the white men float lumber from the ships to the beach. He saw them beat on these timbers with a strange tomahawk, and before his very eyes a canoe was made. It was not like any canoe they had ever seen, nor did they know the boat was called a shallop. The Indians followed the men as they hunted with guns and were frightened by the noise of shooting. They knew the strange canoe was going close to their village, for they could see it in the big bay. After several days of spying, the boy saw a strange sight. The white man took 2 pieces of wood and fastened them together, making a marker. This was a cross. Though the Indians had never heard of one, the white man also stuck a pole in the ground, which had bright colors attached to it, the flag of England. The cross was raised on a sand dune. All the men came ashore from their boats and knelt on their knees about this new and different totem pole. One man stood up holding something in his hands and spoke in solemn words. The Indians did not understand this was the white man's way of thanking his God for a safe journey across the big sea waters. Leaving the cross, the men returned to their boats, set their sails, and moved across the bay and out of sight. It was a long time before Swiftfoot saw the white men again, but he never forgot the first hunting trip in the English year of 1607. Like all these stories, there's a historical background. When the men who came to establish the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown began to sight land, it was along the coast of America at what is now Virginia Beach. Maps of the area made in the 17th century show an inlet from the ocean in what is now called Crystal Lake. Since the 3 little ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, needed a quiet anchorage, they no doubt used this inlet. The fact that one of the members of the party, the Honorable George Percy, kept a diary and described his impressions during the several days they spent in the area after the landing adds to the history of this part of the country. Percy tells that soon after they landed, they saw Indians crawling through the hills. The Indians shot arrows and wounded 2 of their party. The English repulsed the savages with gunfire. The voyagers found fresh water running from the cypress pools in what is now Seashore State Park. From Percy's diary we read, "Therefore we landed and discovered a little way, but could find nothing but fair meadows and goodly tall trees, and such fresh water running through the woods as I was almost ravished at the sight of thereof. We came to a place where the natives had a great fire and had newly roasted oysters. When they perceived our coming, they fled to the mountains and left many oysters on the fire. Since the only thing that remotely resembles a mountain here, uh, the hills near Crystal Lake, the English must have anchored their 3 ships in this sheltered inlet. When a band of adventurers set forth to claim a new land for England, it was accustomed to bring along lumber for a cross. In the ceremony, they planted the cross and the flag of England, and a prayer service of thanksgiving for the safe sea voyage was held near Cape Henry by the Reverend Robert Hunt, chaplain of the expedition. The diary written by Percy says that the 7 and 20th day we began to build our shallop, and the 8 and 20th day we launched our shallop. The captain and some gentlemen went in her and discovered up the bay. Since there was a creek shown on old maps connecting Lincoln Bay and Broad Bay to Crystal Lake, it is quite likely the bay was those bodies of water. A shallop was a small skiff similar to a rowboat. The lumber must have been brought along pre-cut in order for the boat to be built and launched in 2 days. Early records tell of 2 Indian villages in the area. One, named Apasas, was located at the entrance of Lynnhaven River near Ocean Park, and the other, Chesapeake, was on the Trantwood property. Old deeds refer to the great Indian fields in the Great Neck area. The Pungo was the name of the chief of the Chesapeake Indian tribe. All right, well, that's the first of several stories that will come from this book. And that's the beginning of an adventure for me this week, and hopefully for you as well. Obviously, the book was written when I was a child. They continually use the word Indian, where many use the word Native American now. You can't change what was written in the past. You just have to understand the context and the spirit with which it was written and try to understand. And Ms. Kyle, I knew personally, and I understood her personal beliefs and philosophies, and so I don't take offense, although I'm not Native American. I don't think that offense was meant by using the word Indian. So anyway, I'm going to get on to the next one, which I believe is going to take me just south of here to another cool spot. So I'll see you when I get there. Love you guys. Peace.